In the time before the sun has risen over the eastern sea, the city of Alexandria lies very still. The harbor is quiet, the great ships resting dark and heavy at their moorings, their reflections barely stirring on water that has not yet caught the light. The streets of the city, which will by mid-morning hum and press and fill with voices from a dozen lands, are almost empty now. A dog moves along a wall, somewhere in the distance. The air carries the salt of the Mediterranean, cool and clean, and beneath it the faint warm smell of bread, already baking in someone's oven, the first small fire of the day, sending its thin thread of smoke up into a sky that is just beginning, at its eastern edge, to soften from black into the deepest shade of blue. Near the Mouseion quarter, where the royal buildings and the great scholarly precinct of the Mouseion stand in their ordered dignity, the streets are narrower and quieter still, and here in a modest dwelling, set along one of the side passages running off a colonnaded street, the scribe is waking. The room is small and simply kept, the walls are plastered smooth and whitewashed, and the single window that faces the passage outside lets in nothing yet but darkness and the cool air. There is a low bed frame, strung with rope, a folded blanket of undyed wool that has been pushed aside, a clay lamp on a shelf, with its wick just trimmed, and its small flame steady in the still air. A wooden chest stands against one wall. A ceramic bowl and a jug of water rest on a low table near the window. These are the furnishings of a careful and modest life, and they have the quiet orderliness of a space tended with daily attention. The scribe rises slowly, in the manner of someone long accustomed to early hours, who has made a kind of peace with the darkness of the pre-dawn, and found over many years that there is something restful in it rather than something harsh. The body moves through its familiar ritual of waking, the gradual straightening, the bare feet finding the cool stone floor, the brief stillness of a person gathering themselves from the edges of sleep into the full presence of morning. Outside very faintly comes the sound of another pair of sandals somewhere on the stone of the street, someone else already moving through the city on quiet and necessary business. The washing is done with the water from the clay jug, poured carefully into the bowl. The water is cool, cooler than the air, and the scribe wets both hands and brings them to the face, to the back of the neck, to the wrists. There is no haste in this. The light of the small lamp throws a warm and wavering circle of amber onto the plastered wall, and in this circle, the morning ritual proceeds at its own unhurried pace. The bowl of water, when the washing is finished, catches the lamplight in a way that makes it look briefly like something precious before the scribe sets it aside. Dressing takes very little time. The linen is fine enough for a man of the scribal class, woven to a medium weight that is comfortable in both the cool of early morning and the warmth of the Alexandrian afternoon. The garment is a simple wrapped and draped length of pale cloth, off-white in the lamplight, slightly yellowed at the edges from many washings in the alkaline water of the city. It is arranged with practiced ease, the folds falling into their familiar positions as though they remember where they are meant to go. Sandals of plain leather are fastened at the ankle with a thin strap. A second piece of linen, lighter and less carefully arranged, is folded and set aside to be taken along as a wrap against the morning chill of the streets. The morning meal is eaten slowly and without ceremony, seated on the low wooden stool that serves as the one chair in the small room. The bread was bought the evening before from a baker whose stall stands at the end of the colonnaded street, and it is a flat round loaf, slightly dense, with a crust that has hardened pleasantly overnight. A small ceramic dish holds a handful of olives, dark and salt-cured, glistening faintly. There is a cup of wine well diluted with water in the proportions that most people of Alexandria favored for the morning, more water than wine, so that the drink is cool and light and carries only the faintest warmth of the grape. The bread is torn in pieces and eaten with the olives. The cup is raised and set down again. The lamp flame bends very slightly in some current of air too gentle to feel, then straightens again. These small repetitions are the texture of a morning that has occurred in very similar form on hundreds of other mornings before this one, and there is a deep comfort in that sameness. When the meal is finished and the cup set aside, the scribe turns to the matter of the tools. They rest on the wooden chest in a careful arrangement that will be replicated again at the end of this day when they are returned to their place. There are several reed pens cut from the hollow stems of marsh reeds, each trimmed at the writing end to a fine point, with a small knife that has a short bone handle worn smooth with use. The pens are checked by sight and by touch, running a finger along the split of the nib to feel whether the cut is still clean and even. One pen is set aside to be retrimmed, the others are gathered into a small bundle. The knife itself is tucked into a fold of cloth for safe carrying. The ink jar is of dark glazed ceramic, stoppered with a piece of tightly fitted cork, and when the stopper is briefly lifted and then replaced, there is a faint smell of soot and gum, and something faintly acrid that is not unpleasant, the smell, in a particular way, of the work itself. These items are wrapped in a square of cloth and secured. The scribe lifts the bundle and holds it for a moment, settling its familiar weight into the crook of one arm. The lamp is extinguished with a gentle breath, and the room fills at once with the darkness that is no longer quite darkness, because outside, while the morning's preparations have been underway, the sky has continued its slow and imperceptible lightening, and now through the small window, the passage outside is just barely visible, the whitewashed wall of the opposite building, a pale gray shape in the earliest morning light. The door is opened. The air that comes in is cool, and carries that particular quality of pre-dawn Alexandria, salt and stone, and the very distant warmth of the bakery fire. The scribe steps out into the passage, the door pulled closed behind with the soft sound of wood on stone, and begins the walk through the quiet streets toward the great library, where the scrolls are waiting in their long rows in the dark, patient and still, as they have been waiting all through the night. The passage opens onto a narrow street still cool with the residue of night, the stone underfoot faintly damp from the moisture that settles along the waterfront in the hours before dawn. The scribe's sandals make a soft and unhurried sound against the paving, a sound that is quickly joined by others, for Alexandria does not wake all at once, but rather in gradual layers, each neighborhood stirring at its own pace, adding its small noises to the quiet, until the whole city is gently, steadily alive. In these first minutes of walking, the light is still the gray-blue of earliest morning, neither night nor day, the buildings on either side of the street reduced to their simplest shapes, white walls, dark doorways, the occasional fig tree pressing its branches over a rooftop's edge. The air carries the smell of salt very distinctly at this hour, before the day's other smells have had time to gather and compete. It comes from the harbor, which is not far, and it has in it something clean and ancient, the smell of open water carried inland on a light and steady breeze that moves through the streets like something searching. Mingled with it, growing stronger as the scribe turns southward along a wider lane, is the smell of baking bread, yeast and heat, and the faint char of a wood fire, drifting from a bakery whose shutters are already open. The glow of the oven visible through a low doorway, a figure moving inside with the practiced, unhurried movements of someone deep into their morning's work. The bakery is past and its warmth falls away behind, replaced again by the salt air and the cool of the street. A few other figures move through the lanes at this hour, another worker carrying a bundle of cloth, a man with a small cart whose single wheel turns with a faint rhythmic creak against the stone, a woman standing at a doorway, speaking in a low voice to someone still inside, her words indistinct, but her tone easy and familiar. None of these figures hurry. The morning has its own pace, and the city understands it. As the scribe moves eastward and then north, the streets begin to widen. Alexandria was laid out in a grid, its avenues broad and deliberate, planned long before most of its current buildings were raised, and this orderliness becomes more apparent with each block walked. The side lanes give way to colonnaded streets whose stone columns are just now beginning to catch the first true light, the pale gold of a Mediterranean dawn that arrives not in a rush, but in a slow and gentle brightening, as though the sun itself is easing into the day with all the patience of a careful scholar unrolling a scroll. The white limestone of the buildings on either side takes this light and holds it, so that the whole street seems to glow faintly from within, the shadows between the columns still deep in blue, while the upper facades turn to amber and cream. Market stalls are being set up along these colonnaded stretches. Merchants arrive with baskets and bundles, setting out their goods on low wooden tables or spreading cloth across the flat stone of the walkway, figs arranged in careful rows, onions bound in bundles of 10, jars of oil sealed with cloth and string. The movements involved in setting up a market stall are quiet and repetitive and deeply familiar, accomplished largely in silence or in murmured exchanges between neighboring vendors who have shared this stretch of colonnade for many seasons and have no need of many words. A young man sets down a large clay vessel with careful deliberateness, steadying it against the column behind him. An older woman unfolds a length of linen and smooths it over a table with both hands, running her palms across it to press out the creases. The scribe passes through these preparations without pausing, a familiar figure to some of the vendors. One man lifts a hand in quiet greeting, which is returned, and continues north toward the Canopic Way. The Canopic Way is the great central avenue of Alexandria, running the width of the city from east to west, wide enough for several carts to pass abreast, with room to spare on either side. In the middle of the day it is filled with traffic and noise and the full press of a busy city's commerce, but at this early hour it lies almost empty, its great length stretching away in both directions as a pale and luminous expanse of limestone pavement. The columns that line it stand at regular intervals, their capitals catching the morning light, and at this hour the whole avenue has the quality of a very large and quiet room, the sounds of the surrounding city present but softened, the space itself feeling uncommonly still. A few carts move at its far end, small with distance. A dog crosses the avenue without urgency, disappearing between two columns on the far side. The scribe steps out onto the Canopic Way and walks along its southern edge, the harbor invisible to the north, but present in the smell of the air and in the particular quality of the light above the rooftops, which carries a brightness off the water even when the water itself cannot be seen. Looking northward between buildings and down side streets, there are glimpses of the harbor, brief, bright flashes of reflected morning light from its surface, the masts of ships rising against a sky that is now fully gold along the horizon and pale and clear above. The harbor of Alexandria is one of the great harbors of the world, deep and protected, and alive at almost every hour with the movement of vessels, arriving from and departing for every part of the known sea. Even now, in the early morning, there is movement on the water, dark shapes of ships at anchor, the small quick movement of a rowing boat crossing toward the shore, the faint sound of voices carrying across the water in the way that sound does over open water, traveling farther than it seems like it should. The scribe continues along the Canopic Way and then turns south, passing through a quieter residential quarter where the houses are somewhat larger and set behind low walls, their courtyards still in shadow, the sound of a fountain audible from behind one wall, a steady, unhurried sound of water falling into water. The streets here are clean and well-maintained, the pavement smooth underfoot, and the morning air in this quarter carries the smell of jasmine from a vine climbing a garden wall, its white flowers small and numerous in the growing light. The walls of the royal quarter become visible now, to the south and east, pale limestone rising above the surrounding buildings, and beyond them, just barely distinguishable at this distance, the outlines of the Mouseion complex, the colonnaded walkways, the roof lines, the first suggestion of the ordered, shaded world within. The scribe's pace does not quicken. There is no urgency, only the pleasant and habitual draw of a familiar destination, the gentle orientation of a morning walk that has been made many times, and is made again now with the same quiet and unhurried attention. The bundle of tools steady in the crook of one arm, the sandals soft on the stone, the city settling fully into its morning around each careful step. The gate of the Mouseion is set into a long, low wall of pale stone, and it is wide enough that two scholars might pass through it side by side without any need to turn or press close. It stands open at this hour, as it stands open each morning when the light has grown sufficient for reading, and the custodian who tends this entrance, an older man with a close-cropped beard gone almost entirely to gray, lifts a hand in quiet greeting as the scribe approaches. No words are exchanged at first. None are needed. The recognition between them is of the sort that accumulates over many seasons of the same morning arrival, the same unhurried step, the same bundle of tools, and it expresses itself simply and sufficiently in the slight inclination of the head, the brief shared acknowledgement of another day beginning. The scribe passes through the gate and the world changes. It is difficult to say precisely how it changes, or to identify any single quality of the place that produces the effect, and yet the effect is undeniable and immediate. Something in the quality of the air is different here, slightly cooler and more still, held by the walls and the plantings, and the mass of stone that has been absorbing and releasing the night's coolness through the early hours. Something in the quality of the sound is different too. The city does not vanish entirely. It is still audible beyond the walls, the distant sounds of carts and voices and the harbor in the far background. But those sounds are softened and set at a remove, as though the gate itself functions as a kind of membrane, through which the ordinary noise of the world passes only partially and at diminished volume. What remains inside the precinct is a hush, not a silence precisely, but a quality of quiet that has been deliberately cultivated here over many generations, maintained by the architecture and the plantings, and by the shared understanding of everyone who enters, that this is a place where the interior life of thought requires a certain exterior stillness in order to flourish. The colonnaded walkway that runs along the inner face of the wall is the first thing one properly sees after passing through the gate, and the scribe has seen it hundreds of times and finds it still, on most mornings, worth a moment's quiet attention. The columns are of white marble, not enormous but well proportioned, spaced at even intervals, so that the eye moves along them naturally and without effort, drawn forward by the gentle rhythm of stone and shadow in stone. Between each pair of columns, the light falls in long pale bands across the worn stone floor of the walkway, and at this hour those bands carry within them the particular clear quality of early Mediterranean morning light, bright and clean and without the heaviness it will acquire later in the day when the sun has had time to warm the air and raise the dust. Small birds move in and out of the columns, and their sounds, quick, untroubled, entirely indifferent to scholarship, contribute something pleasant and living to the general quiet of the place. To the right of the walkway, set behind a low edging of clipped stone and plantings of rosemary and bay, lies the garden. It is not a large garden by the standards of wealthy private households, but it is carefully tended and arranged with an eye toward providing shade and a degree of repose at various hours of the day. Several old plane trees grow here, their broad leaves casting pools of shadow that will shift and deepen as the morning progresses. A small stone channel carries water along one edge of the planting, supplying the roots of the trees and the rosemary, and keeping the air immediately above it slightly cool and faintly scented with dampness and earth. Stone benches are placed at intervals beneath the trees, and in the late afternoon and early evening these benches are often occupied by scholars reading or in low conversation. But at this hour of the morning they are empty and still, the stone not yet warmed by the sun, the shadows of the leaves lying across them, undisturbed. Further along, past the garden and opening out to the right of the main walkway, is the exedra, the large semicircular space with its curved bench of stone set against the curving back wall, the open front looking out toward the garden and the sky. It is here that the Mouseion scholars gather in the late morning or at midday for the kind of longer conversation that requires more room than a corridor or a garden path can easily provide, where a point of textual interpretation or a question of philosophical method might be turned over at leisure, examined from several sides, and set down again unresolved or perhaps clarified, the process being in many ways as valued as any conclusion it might produce. At this early hour the exedra is unoccupied, and the scribe glances into it as he passes and notes the quality of stillness within it, the curved wall a warm pale ochre in the morning light, the stone bench smooth and cool-looking, a single dry leaf resting at the center of the floor, where it has blown in from the garden and remained undisturbed. Two other scribes are arriving at roughly the same time, coming from a different direction across the precinct, and the greetings exchanged are warm but quiet, suited to the hour and the place. A few words about the morning, a gesture toward the cloudless sky, a brief question about some piece of work left unfinished the previous afternoon. These are the small and comfortable exchanges of people who have shared a working space for a long time, and whose familiarity has settled into something easy and undemanding, requiring no performance and no particular effort to sustain. One of the custodians, a younger man this time, carrying a broom of bundled rushes, moves through the far end of the colonnade with the slow, methodical attention of someone who takes a genuine interest in keeping a floor clean, and he too receives and returns a nod, and then the morning returns to its baseline of quiet, the three scribes continuing toward the entrance of the main hall at the unhurried pace that the precinct itself seems to encourage. The storerooms are visible as one approaches the hall, lower buildings set behind and to one side, their interiors accessible through narrow doorways fitted with wooden doors that stand slightly ajar. Through one such doorway as the scribe passes, there is a glimpse of the interior, the shelving along the walls, the rows upon rows of papyrus rolls in their pigeonholes, each one a pale cylinder in the dimmer light, some of them faintly gleaming where the grain of the papyrus catches what little light enters. There is a custodian inside, arranging something, moving slowly and carefully among the shelves, and the sight of him there, the ordered rows of rolls, the careful tending, the quiet purposefulness of the work, is a thing the scribe has seen countless times, and which still carries, on most mornings, a faint quality of satisfaction simply to observe. Then the main hall. The entrance is not marked by any particular ceremony of architecture, no grand stairway, no towering doorway out of proportion with the rest, but rather by a simple and well-made threshold of dressed stone, the wooden doors open and folded back against the outer wall, the interior visible as a long space in which the morning light enters from high windows set near the roof, and falls in soft columns down through the still air. The sound of the hall is the sound of its own particular quiet, distinct from the quiet of the garden or the colonnade, being deeper and more enclosed, and within that quiet, the first small sounds of the day's work are just beginning, the soft movement of a scholar settling at a work surface, the brief sound of a wooden stool being adjusted, the almost imperceptible rustle of a scroll being carefully unrolled. And there is the smell. It arrives as it always does at this moment of crossing the threshold, not overwhelming, not sharp, but present and unmistakable, the accumulated breath of the hall itself. Papyrus, dry and slightly grassy, with the faint sweetness that old material takes on when it has been kept well and handled often. Beneath that, the mineral darkness of old ink, the particular dry dustiness of carbon long since dried into its words, and beneath that still, the slow warm scent of cedar, the wood of the shelving releasing its oil into the still air, as it has done through every night and every day for as long as anyone in this hall can remember. The scribe breathes it in, not dramatically, not with any theatrical pause, but simply and fully, the way one breathes in a familiar and welcome thing, and then moves quietly to the work surface, sets down the bundle of tools, and allows the morning to begin. The hall holds its quiet for a little while longer before the work truly begins. There is always this interval, this soft pause between arrival and the first purposeful gesture of the day, and the scribe has learned over many seasons to inhabit it without hurry. The eyes move slowly around the room, taking in what is always there and yet never entirely the same from one morning to the next. The way the early light falls differently as the year turns, the slight variation in how many colleagues have arrived, the particular arrangement of scrolls that the custodians have left out from the previous afternoon's work. The hall is a constant, and yet it breathes. The shelves line the walls in long, unbroken rows, built from pale wood worn smooth at the edges, where countless hands have reached and returned and reached again. Each shelf is divided at regular intervals into compartments, upright wooden partitions creating a series of cells not unlike the structure of a honeycomb, though made square and orderly by human hands. These pigeonholes, as they are known among those who work here, hold the rolls in their resting position, each one standing upright or lying on its side, each one wrapped in its own way and tied with a length of linen string that has been wound around the outside of the roll and knotted with a small practice loop. The string holds the roll closed, keeps the papyrus from gradually loosening and unfurling in the still air, and serves also as the anchor for something small and important that hangs from it. That small thing is the syllabus. It is nothing more than a narrow tack of papyrus or sometimes of thin leather, attached to the string and left to hang just at the outer edge of the pigeonhole so that it can be read without the need to remove the scroll itself. On it, written in careful small letters, is the title of the work and the name of the author, and sometimes a number, indicating where in a sequence this particular roll falls, the third book of a longer work, the second of 2 rolls needed to contain a lengthy treatise. The syllabus is a modest thing, pale and small, easily overlooked by someone who did not know what it was for. But without it, the work of this place would slow to a near halt, A reader searching for a particular text could spend the better part of a morning unrolling and re-rolling scrolls in sequence, peering at the opening lines to identify the work, if not for those small hanging tags. The syllabus is the quiet architecture of access, the detail that makes the whole enormous collection navigable to a human being standing in the hall with a question and an hour of morning light. The collection is very large. Estimates pass between scholars, sometimes spoken in the tone of wonder that very large numbers tend to produce, and the figures named are not always the same. This is the nature of a living collection that is always growing, always being added to, never quite finished and never meant to be. What is certain is that the shelves hold many tens of thousands of rolls, and perhaps considerably more, gathered over many generations through the deliberate effort of the Ptolemaic rulers who built this institution, and who understood from the beginning that a great library was not assembled by accident or gradual accumulation alone, but by intention and by reach. The reach of this particular institution extended, at its most active, to every ship that entered the great harbor of Alexandria. Royal decree established the practice. Any vessel arriving in the harbor that carried books among its cargo was required to surrender those books. Not permanently in most cases, but long enough for the scribes of the library to make copies. The original texts were sometimes returned to their owners, and sometimes it is said that the copies were returned in their place, the originals remaining behind in the collection. Whether this arrangement was always entirely welcome to those who arrived with texts they considered their own is a matter that the records do not dwell upon. What it produced, over many years, was a collection drawn from every corner of the Greek-speaking world and beyond, texts that had originated in Athens and Corinth and Rhodes, in the cities of Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean, in the older literary cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, rendered into forms that Greek readers could encounter. Works came also by purchase and by gift, carried by scholars who arrived to work here and brought their personal libraries with them, incorporated into the great whole. The organization of all of this into something comprehensible was its own form of scholarship, perhaps the foundational form that made all other scholarship possible here. The rolls are grouped by subject, and within subject by the region or tradition from which they originate, and within that by author, and within author by the sequence of works. Poetry occupies its own long section of the hall, and within poetry the lyric poets stand apart from the epic poets, and the comic writers apart from the tragic. Philosophy takes up another portion, the long, careful texts of those who thought about the nature of things, the structure of the world, the behavior of the mind, the principles by which one ought to live. Medicine fills its own shelves, the accumulated knowledge of generations of healers writing down what they had observed and theorized and tested, organized so that a physician seeking a specific treatment or a theoretical discussion could find their way through. Mathematics and geometry have their place, as does the vast and growing body of writing concerned with the earth itself, geography, the description of coastlines and river systems and mountain ranges and distant peoples, the attempts to measure the circumference of the world by careful reasoning, and the observation of shadows. History occupies many roles, the accounts of wars and rulers and city-states and the customs of peoples who lived far from the Mediterranean. There are works of astronomy, careful records of the movements of stars and planets, calculations of cycles and risings and settings. There are works that do not fit neatly into any category, and are noted with a degree of scholarly uncertainty on the syllabus, placed where they seem most to belong, by the best judgment of whoever made the decision. To hold one of these rolls in the hand is to encounter something that never quite becomes ordinary, however many hundreds of times the gesture is repeated. A papyrus scroll has its own particular weight and presence, not heavy, but substantial, the weight of many layers pressed and dried together into a surface that has both firmness and a slight give. When it is unrolled, carefully, with both hands, one hand feeding and one hand receiving, the papyrus opens in a continuous pale expanse, cream-colored or faintly golden depending on its age and origin, marked across its width with columns of text written in the horizontal direction of the fibers that run across the inner surface of the sheet. The columns are narrow by convention, wide enough to hold a line of verse or a sentence of prose, separated from one another by margins of plain papyrus, and the eye moves down each column and then shifts to the next with a regularity that after long practice becomes nearly automatic. The texture beneath the fingers is smooth, in the way of natural materials that have been worked and pressed and dried with care. Not silky, but soft enough that it does not catch or roughen the skin. Old scrolls carry in their material a certain quality that is difficult to name precisely. They have been handled by other hands in other rooms and other cities, perhaps in libraries or private studies, or the homes of scholars now long dead, and that passage of time and touch has given the surface a particular quality, a slight darkness at the edges where fingers have rested most often, a suppleness in the papyrus itself that comes from years of being held. There is nothing dramatic in this observation. It is simply that the scroll has a history of its own that predates its arrival in this hall, and that history is present in the material, quiet and unhurried, the way all old things carry their age without announcing it. The scribe holds the roll gently, as one holds anything that is both useful and worth preserving, and prepares at last to begin the morning's work. Before the first stroke of ink is laid down upon fresh papyrus, there is preparation, and the scribe attends to this preparation with the same quiet care that will be given to the writing itself. The tools of the craft are not merely instruments. They are materials that have their own nature, their own requirements, their own way of responding to the hands that use them. And a scribe who has worked for many years comes to know these materials the way one knows anything that is encountered daily and handled with attention, intimately, without needing to think about the knowing. The ink is considered first. In many scriptoriums and workrooms across the ancient world, scribes of this period prepare their ink from a combination of lampblack or fine soot, gum arabic, and water, and the preparation of a fresh supply, when the small jar has grown low, is one of the quieter and more meditative tasks of the working life. The soot used for this purpose is gathered from the burning of oil lamps or pine resin, and it must be fine and even. Coarse particles would catch on the fibers of the papyrus and leave rough marks, interrupting the smooth flow of a well-formed letter. The finest soot settles like a kind of dark powder, weightless almost, and when gathered carefully and measured into a small vessel, it lies there dense and black and completely still. Gum arabic, which is the dried resin of certain acacia trees, arrives at the workshop in small pale amber lumps that are partially transparent, catching light in the way of polished stone. A small quantity of this gum is dissolved in water. Warm water encourages the dissolving more readily, and the resulting liquid is thick and slightly syrupy in the way of diluted honey, though without any sweetness. When the powdered soot is introduced into this gum solution and worked in with a small wooden implement, stirring slowly and with patience, the mixture gradually deepens and darkens and becomes uniform, the particles suspending themselves evenly throughout the liquid, rather than clumping or settling. This process cannot be hurried. If stirred too quickly, the ink becomes aerated and uneven. If left too long between stirrings, the heavier particles begin to settle toward the bottom and must be worked back into suspension. The finished ink, when it has reached the correct consistency, coatings the wooden stirring implement in a smooth, unbroken film. It is intensely black, the way charcoal ash is black, with no brown or gray undertone, and it dries on papyrus quickly and permanently, becoming part of the surface rather than merely resting upon it. A well-made batch of ink will last for several days in a tightly stoppered jar, and the scribe keeps the jar close during working hours, returning the stopper between uses to slow evaporation. If the ink becomes too thick over the course of the morning, it can be loosened with a small addition of water, stirred carefully until it returns to the proper flow. The reed pens require their own attention. The reeds used for writing are cut from stands of marsh reed that grow along river edges and in wetland areas throughout Egypt and the wider Mediterranean region, and they arrive at the workshop in lengths that must be trimmed and shaped before they can be used. The scribe keeps a small sharp knife for this purpose, and the trimming of a new pen is a task that rewards care and patience. The thick end of the reed is left as a grip. It sits comfortably in the crease between the thumb and first two fingers, resting lightly, requiring no great pressure to hold. Toward the narrower end, the reed must be cut at an angle to form a nib, and this angled cut determines the character of the line the pen will produce. A steep angle creates a fine, narrow mark. A shallower angle produces a broader stroke. After the initial angle is cut, a small slit is made at the very tip of the nib, running perhaps the length of a thumbnail up the center of the reed. This slit is what allows the ink to flow from the hollow interior of the reed down onto the writing surface in a controlled and steady way. Too short a slit and the ink will not flow freely enough, requiring additional pressure that tires the hand and produces uneven marks. Too long a slit and the ink flows too readily, pooling and spreading at the edges of each stroke. The cutting of this slit is done slowly, with the knife held very still, and experienced scribes develop a feel for the correct length through long repetition. When the nib has been properly shaped and the slit correctly made, the pen is dipped into the ink, and a trial stroke is made on a small scrap of papyrus kept at the edge of the writing surface. If the line flows cleanly and evenly, dark and unbroken, the pen is ready for use. A scribe working steadily through a long morning may trim and adjust the nib of the same pen several times, as it wears or splits with use. The life of a reed pen in active use is measured in hours rather than days, and the small knife is always kept close at hand. Several pens are trimmed and prepared at the beginning of each working session, so that when one becomes worn or damaged it can be set aside, and a fresh one taken up without interrupting the rhythm of the work. The papyrus itself, upon which all this careful work will finally rest, has a quality that rewards slow observation. It is made from the pith of the papyrus plant, which grows abundantly in the Nile Delta, and the process by which plant matter is transformed into writing surface is one that was well established by this period and carried out by specialists whose workshops supplied libraries, administrative offices, and private scholars throughout the Mediterranean world. The pith of the plant is cut into thin strips and laid out in overlapping layers, one horizontal layer, one vertical, and then pressed under weight and dried in the sun, the natural sugars of the plant acting as an adhesive that binds the layers into a single coherent sheet. The result is a material that is pale, in shades ranging from a soft cream to a warm golden tone depending on the age and quality of the batch, and it has a very slight texture, not rough, but not entirely smooth either, with the fine cross-hatching of the two layers of fibers faintly visible when a sheet is held at an angle to the light. When held up before a window or a lamp, the sheet transmits the light in a diffuse, even way, glowing slightly, the fiber pattern becoming more visible, but never harsh, the whole surface taking on a warm translucence. Scribes learn quickly to distinguish papyrus of good quality from papyrus that will cause difficulties. The poorer grades have visible imperfections, soft spots where the pressing was uneven, or raised ridges where strips have overlapped too thickly. These imperfections will catch the nib of a reed pen and cause ink to spread or the line to break. The selected sheet is placed upon the writing board, which is a piece of smooth, flat wood of modest size, light enough to be held in the lap or rested upon a low table with ease. The board provides a firm and even surface beneath the papyrus, which without such support would flex and shift under the pressure of the pen, making even, controlled strokes difficult to achieve. The papyrus is not fastened to the board, but lies upon it naturally, held in place by the weight of the hand and the slight natural grip between the two materials. Nearby, within easy reach, sits a small ceramic bowl containing a little water. This water serves a particular corrective purpose. Fresh ink, before it is fully dried and bonded with the papyrus fibers, can be lightly dampened and gently removed with a cloth or a smooth tool, allowing a small error to be lifted from the surface without damaging the papyrus beneath. This correction must be done quickly, before the ink has set, and with a light touch, and the results are not always perfect, but in the hands of someone practiced in the method, small mistakes can be managed quietly, and the work continued without the need for a fresh sheet. The posture adopted for writing settles into one of two arrangements that are common among scribes of this period and region. Some prefer to sit cross-legged upon a mat or cushion on the floor, the writing board resting across the knees, the whole body in a low and stable position that allows the arm to move freely from the shoulder. Others prefer a low stool of the kind common in Egyptian and Greek workshops, sitting with the feet resting flat upon the floor, the board held or propped at a slight angle. Either posture, practiced over years, becomes comfortable and natural, requiring no conscious thought to maintain. The body finds its way into the familiar position as the pen finds its way to the ink, and the ink finds its way to the papyrus. and the scribe settles into the quiet readiness of someone who is about to begin work that they have done many times before and will do again, steadily, through the long and unhurried morning ahead. The scroll that waits at the edge of the writing board is not new. It has been used before, many times, by other hands, and this is visible in the small ways that age and handling leave their marks upon papyrus. The outer edge of the roll is slightly darkened where fingers have touched it most often, and there are places along its length where the surface has become soft and yielding, the fibers of the plant beginning, very slowly, to separate from one another in the way that all organic things eventually soften and give way. The ink on its surface is still legible, still precise in its outlines, but it has taken on the warm amber tone that black ink acquires over decades, settling from a deep darkness into something closer to brown, like shadow seen through old water. It is a scroll of Greek verse, lyric poetry composed in an earlier century, and it has traveled some distance, through several hands, and perhaps more than one city, before coming to rest in the keeping of this library. Beside it lies a second scroll, somewhat younger in appearance, the ink still holding a deeper tone, the papyrus less worn at its edges. This is the second version of the same text, or very nearly the same text, because it is already apparent, even before the work begins, that the two copies do not agree in every particular. This is the nature of copied texts. Every time a scribe reproduces a work by hand, there exists the possibility of a slight divergence, a word misread, a line where two similar phrases have been confused, a passage where the copyist's own memory or expectation has quietly overridden what was written on the page before them. Over many generations and many copyings, these small variations accumulate, and what arrives in Alexandria may be a text that differs from what the poet first set down, in ways both minor and occasionally more significant. Part of the library's great and careful work is to compare these versions, to read them side by side, with patience and scholarly attention, and to establish as best as can be determined the reading that is most likely to be the original and most faithful to the author's intention. This comparing and establishing of a trustworthy text is work that requires both the scribe's careful hand and the scholar's trained judgment, and on many mornings the two rolls come together, quietly in the same seated figure at the writing board. The scribe unrolls the first scroll a short distance, enough to expose several columns of text, and leans it gently against a small wooden prop so that it rests at a readable angle, without requiring a hand to hold it in place. The second scroll is similarly arranged beside it, angled slightly differently, so that both can be consulted without turning the body sharply or reaching across the workspace. The fresh sheet of papyrus on the writing board is pale and ready. The reed pen is trimmed. The ink, freshly prepared this morning, rests in its shallow bowl of fired clay, dark and smooth and exactly the right consistency, neither too thick to flow freely from the tip of the pen, nor too watery to hold a clean and steady line upon the surface of the sheet. Before the pen is lifted, there is a moment of reading. The scribe reads silently, eyes moving along the first lines of the verse in the older scroll, taking in the shape of the words and the rhythm of the meter, which in lyric poetry has a particular cadence that can be felt as much as heard, even in silence. The lines are short, as lyric verse tends to be, broken into the compact arrangements of syllables that give this form of poetry its music. Reading them, the scribe holds them in mind with a quality of attention that is neither rushed nor entirely effortless. It is the focused attention of someone who is receiving something and preparing to transmit it, holding a small passage of language steady in memory long enough to set it down faithfully on the fresh page. This interval between reading and writing is brief, often no longer than a slow breath or two, but it is real, and it matters. It is the moment when the text passes through a human mind and is in some sense understood and then released again in a new form. The pen touches the ink and then touches the papyrus, and the first strokes of the first letter appear. Greek letters in the hands of a practiced scribe emerge with a consistency that comes from long repetition, each character formed by the same sequence of movements executed without deliberate thought. The hand knows the shapes. The particular script used in this period has its own character, not so different from the formal inscriptions carved in stone, but looser, more adapted to the speed that writing requires, with strokes that connect and flow in ways that monumental lettering does not. The letters stand at a slight rightward angle, and there is a pleasing evenness to their height across the line, the pen held at a consistent slant that produces thick strokes in one direction and thin strokes in the other, giving the text a quiet visual rhythm of its own. A line of verse is set down, then another. The scribe pauses, reads the next passage from the older scroll, glances at the corresponding place in the newer copy, and finds that here, in this stanza, the two versions agree entirely. There is a particular quiet satisfaction in this kind of agreement, a small confirmation that the text has traveled well, that it has not been altered in its passage from copy to copy. The pen moves again, and the lines accumulate on the fresh papyrus in a column that is clean and even, the margins consistent, the spacing between lines generous enough to allow each row of letters to breathe without crowding the one below it. The quality of concentration this work demands is difficult to describe precisely, because it is not the sharp and effortful attention of someone solving a problem or performing a calculation. It is closer to a sustained and quiet alertness, the kind that settles over a person who is engaged in something familiar and absorbing, where the body and mind are both occupied, but neither is straining. The eye reads, the memory holds, the hand writes, and these three activities pass into one another with a smoothness that, over years of practice, becomes almost seamless. Errors happen even so, because no sustained attention is perfect, and the mind occasionally produces a word it expects to find rather than the one that is actually there. But the practiced scribe catches most of these moments before they become errors on the page, because the rhythm of the verse itself will sometimes announce a divergence, a syllable that does not fit the meter, a phrase that lands in the wrong place in the cadence, and this small disruption draws the eye back to the scroll for a second look, before the pen commits anything to the fresh papyrus. From the wider hall beyond the immediate workspace, there comes the collective sound of other scribes at their work, and it is one of the most characteristic sounds of this place in the morning hours. The scratch of reed on papyrus is a dry, fine sound, softer than one might expect, more like the movement of a leaf across stone than anything harder or sharper. Heard singly, it might barely register. Heard from many hands at once, spread across a large room, it becomes a kind of quiet texture in the air, a continuous and gentle presence that over time becomes as unremarkable and as comforting as the sound of a breeze through leaves outside a window. Within this general softness, other sounds move occasionally, the soft rustle of a scroll being unrolled, its papyrus giving a faint crackle as the curve of the roll is coaxed gently open. The light sound of a pen being set down on the edge of a board, the very low murmur of two scribes exchanging a word about something in the text before them, quickly finished, and followed again by silence. No one speaks loudly. The hall has a natural culture of quietness, not enforced by any rule that needs stating, but simply understood and maintained by common agreement among people who know what this kind of work requires. Sustained copying is not compatible with distraction, and the scholars and scribes who gather here each morning have come to value the particular atmosphere that shared silence creates, a silence that is not empty but full, inhabited by the presence of many minds engaged in the same broad purpose, each bent over a different text, each moving through the same slow rhythm of reading and recording that the morning's light permits. The column of text on the fresh papyrus grows line by careful line. The stanza breaks are noted with a small marker in the margin, a light horizontal stroke that helps the eye find its place when the scroll is read later. Where the two older versions of the poem have disagreed about a particular word, the scribe has noted the variant reading in a small notation alongside the main text, a practice common among those doing this kind of careful comparative work, so that whoever reads this new copy will know that a question exists and will have before them the evidence needed to consider it. These small marginal notes are written in a slightly finer hand, the letters made smaller to fit within the narrow space beside the column, and they require a steady pen and an unhurried movement that comes naturally in the morning when the hand has not yet tired. The morning light, still early enough to fall at a low angle through the colonnades, rests gently across the writing board in the papyrus, and the fresh ink on the new copy catches it with a faint sheen before it dries completely to its final matte darkness. The scribe reads the next passage, holds it, and writes. And the work continues as it has continued and will continue, steady and patient, through the long and quiet morning hours. As the morning hours deepen, the angle of the light coming through the colonnades shifts in a way that is slow and almost imperceptible at first, the pale early brightness warming by small degrees into something fuller and more golden, a light that seems to gather weight as it moves across the tiled floor and climbs the lower shelves of the reading halls. The scribe, still settled at work, becomes aware of this change, not through any deliberate observation, but through the body's quiet sensitivity to the passing of time. The way the warmth on one side of the face increases gently, the way the shadows cast by the colonnade columns grow a little sharper and a little shorter across the stone. The morning is progressing, unhurried and steady, and the library around the scribe has by now settled fully into the rhythm of its working hours. The reading hall is neither loud nor entirely silent. It holds instead the particular quality of sound that belongs to a place where many minds are concentrated on written words, a sound made of small and scattered things, the soft friction of a papyrus roll being slowly unrolled with careful hands, the faint creak of a wooden scroll stand being adjusted to a better angle, the low murmur of a scholar reading just below the threshold of clear speech, moving the lips slightly over a difficult passage, as though tasting the language. These sounds do not interrupt one another. They blend into a kind of ambient presence, as steady and unobtrusive as the sound of water in a fountain heard from a room away. And within this atmosphere, the work of reading and writing and thinking proceeds without friction. Looking outward from the scribe's immediate workspace, the hall reveals itself as a room inhabited by a considerable variety of people, most of them seated on low stools or on cushioned benches, placed along the walls and between the shelving columns, with their scrolls either open across their knees or resting on the narrow wooden stands that the library keeps available for this purpose. These stands hold the scroll at a slight angle, so that the text faces the reader, without requiring the hands to grip the edges of the papyrus constantly, a small convenience that allows a scholar to sit for many hours without the muscles of the forearms growing fatigued. Some of the scholars in the room have placed a second scroll beside them, closed and waiting, to be consulted after the first is finished, or to be referred to alongside it in a kind of slow conversation between texts. The figures in the hall have come from many places. This is evident in subtle ways, in the different styles of woolen or linen garments they wear, in the varying darkness or lightness of their complexions, in the particular way one man arranges his robe over his lap before settling in to read, and another keeps a small leather satchel close beside him, as though accustomed to traveling with his possessions always within reach. Alexandria is a city that has always drawn people from across the Greek-speaking world and from lands well beyond it. And the library, sitting at the heart of the Mouseion scholarly life, draws in turn the most curious and most learned of those who pass through the city, or who have settled there for a season or for years. On any given morning, the hall holds this mixture without remark or ceremony, each reader absorbed in the particular world of the text before them, the distance between their homelands dissolved quietly by the shared work of reading. Toward the far end of the hall, somewhat apart from the main clustering of readers, a man sits on a bench with a very large scroll opened across a stand before him. The papyrus stretched wider than most of the texts in the room, its columns of writing accompanied at several points by diagrams and figures drawn in careful lines. He is examining a geographical work, a text concerned with the measurement and description of the known world, and he traces with one finger along a line of writing in a way that suggests he is working out a calculation or verifying a distance against something he already holds in memory. He has the unhurried manner of someone who has been sitting with this text for some time already, and expects to continue for some time yet, the patience of a scholar who has perhaps traveled a considerable distance specifically to read this scroll, or one like it, and who is not inclined to waste any of the opportunity. His garment is pinned at the shoulder, in a style that is not commonly seen among the Alexandrian scholars who make up the permanent community of the Mouseion, and the small wooden box of notes and tablets he has set beside him on the bench is worn in a way that suggests long use and long carrying. He reads without murmuring, in complete silence, only occasionally taking up a stylus to press a brief note into one of the wax tablets in the box. The text before him describes coastlines and rivers, and the heights of mountains, the careful accumulated observations of those who have sailed and walked and measured. And the scholar engages with this material with a concentration that is itself quiet and still, as though the world being described in the writing has drawn him into something resembling the calm of a very long journey, remembered from a comfortable place. Near him, and unaware of being observed, a younger scholar sits with a philosophical text, one hand resting flat on the open papyrus as though anchoring it, though the scroll shows no inclination to close. He is not reading in this moment, but thinking, his gaze directed slightly upward into one side at the wall, in the way that eyes sometimes move when the mind is working through an argument, or turning a sentence over to examine it from a different direction. After a moment his gaze drops again to the text, and he reads on, and the small interval of thought is absorbed back into the surrounding quiet, as though it had not occurred. The light continues its slow progression across the floor, the gold of it deepening slightly, and the room seems to settle more fully into itself as the morning advances. There is something in a reading hall at this hour that resists easy description, but is nevertheless very real, a quality of accumulated attention, as though the concentration of many minds working simultaneously in one space has given the air itself a certain density and stillness, the way a room full of sleeping people feels different from an empty room, even before the eye has registered the sleeping forms. The scholars in the hall are not sleeping, but they share something with that quality of inward withdrawal, each of them present in the room and also very far away, traveling through the writing before them into whatever world the text opens. The sense of time in such a room is altered from the time of the street outside. In the street, time moves with the commerce and noise of a living city, with the feet of people going toward particular destinations, with the cries of sellers and the movement of animals and goods. In the reading hall, time is different, slower and less pointed, marked not by the urgency of destination, but by the turning of a scroll, by the completion of a column, by the gradual shift of light across familiar stone. The scholars who come to this room regularly know this quality of time well, and many of them seem to enter it willingly, even gratefully, crossing the threshold of the hall as one might step into a shaded garden out of strong sunlight, the noise and pace of the world outside dropping away behind them as the cool and the quiet close in. The scribe at the familiar writing board is part of this world, and also a particular version of it, engaged not in reading but in the producing of new copies that will in turn be read by others who have not yet arrived, perhaps scholars not yet born, perhaps readers in cities the scribe will never visit. The work is quiet and it is slow, and it connects this morning, this particular fall of golden mid-morning light across a hall of papyrus and still figures, to something very much larger than a single morning, the long accumulation of all the mornings in which someone has sat with a text and given it careful attention, and all the mornings still to come in which someone will do the same. When the morning's copying is complete, the scribe sets down the reed pen with a care that has become habitual over many years, laying it across the edge of the wooden board rather than dropping it, preserving the fine trim tip from any unnecessary contact with the hard surface. The scroll being copied is gently rolled closed, the two wooden rods at its ends turned slowly and evenly so that the papyrus lies flat and undistorted, and then it is tied with its length of string, a simple knot but a precise one, firm without being tight enough to crease the outer layer. The scribe's hands know this action without needing instruction from the mind. The scroll goes back to the shelf, slipped into its pigeonhole with the care one gives to something that belongs somewhere and has now been returned to its proper place. The shift from copying to cataloging work is not abrupt. It happens gradually, as the morning deepens toward midday, the light from the colonnades widening slightly as the sun rises higher and the angle of the beams changes across the floor. Fresh papyrus is brought out, a sheet of good quality, pale and smooth, with the horizontal fibers of its surface lying in a direction that will accept ink steadily and without bleeding. It is placed on the writing board and smoothed once with the flat of the palm. A fresh charge of ink is drawn up into the reed pen, and the scribe pauses for a moment, reviewing the small pile of notes accumulated during the morning, notations made on scraps of papyrus during the copying session, referencing the title of the work, the name recorded as its author, the number of columns completed, and the condition of the original scroll from which the copy was made. The cataloging tradition at the library has a long, careful history behind it. Generations earlier, in the time of a great scholar and poet named Callimachus, the library undertook the immense work of organizing its collection into something that could be navigated and understood, not merely stored. The lists Callimachus and his colleagues produced, known as the Pinaces, were themselves works of considerable labor, a systematic attempt to record who had written what, when they had lived, what the opening words of a given work were, how long it ran, and under which broad subject it might most usefully be gathered. Poetry in its various forms occupied one part of that arrangement, prose works of philosophy, of oratory, of history, of medicine, of mathematics and geometry and the study of the heavens, each found its place in a structure that tried to hold the whole of what was known within a single legible order. The scribe works within this tradition and takes it seriously. The entry being prepared today concerns a newly completed copy of a prose work, a treatise on the properties of plants and their medicinal applications, the kind of text that falls into the broad category of works concerned with natural inquiry. The scribe writes the name of the author first, carefully, in letters that are clear and not hurried, because errors in a name are among the most troublesome to correct and the most consequential when they persist. Below the name comes the title of the work, as it appears on the original scroll's syllabus, that small tag of parchment or papyrus that hangs from the roll. Then the number of rolls that make up the complete work, if it is known to be part of a larger set, is noted, and the condition of the original from which this copy was drawn, whether the earlier scroll was itself a copy of something older, whether it showed signs of damage, whether any passages were already unclear or missing in the original consulted. It is in this part of the work that the scribe must exercise a kind of quiet judgment, because the facts do not always present themselves cleanly. The scroll copied this morning was acquired some time ago from a merchant vessel, part of the regular arrangement by which books entering the harbor were examined and copied on behalf of the library before being returned to their owners, or sometimes retained, with payment made for the original. The scroll's syllabus named an author, but the name given there was one that several scholars of the library had discussed, uncertain whether the work truly belonged to the person named or had been attributed to a well-known figure in order to lend it authority, a practice not unknown in the long history of copied and recopied texts. Attribution was sometimes lost along a chain of copying, and a later scribe might have filled the gap with a plausible name, rather than leave a blank. The scribe pauses now, holding the reed pen lightly above the fresh papyrus, and makes a decision that is also a kind of admission. Rather than recording the attribution as settled fact, the catalogue entry will note that the authorship is a matter of uncertainty, that the name appears on the syllabus of the original, but that the text style and the nature of its content have prompted questions among the scholars who have examined it. This kind of notation is not unusual in the library's lists. The institution has long found it more useful to record uncertainty honestly than to paper over gaps in knowledge with confident-seeming guesses. An honest question in a catalogue is more useful to the next scholar who arrives with fresh information than a false certainty that leads them away from the truth. There is a senior scholar whose opinion the scribe has consulted before on questions of this kind, a man of considerable learning, who has devoted much of his working life to the study of medical and natural historical texts, and who can recognize by the particular weight and arrangement of an argument whether a work belongs to one tradition of thought or another. The scribe rises from the writing board, rolls the notes into a small bundle, and walks unhurriedly through the hall toward the colonnaded walkway where this scholar keeps his own working place, a spot near the end of the row where the light is steady for most of the morning, and where a low shelf holds several scrolls in regular use. The conversation that follows is quiet and without hurry. The senior scholar listens, receives the small bundle of notes, and reads through them with the expression of someone who is following a familiar kind of question down its familiar paths. He speaks at some length, his voice steady and neither loud nor soft, offering what he knows about the author named on the syllabus, about the style of argument in the passage the scribe has transcribed, about one other scroll in the collection that may be by the same hand or may not. He does not reach a definitive conclusion, because the evidence does not permit one. But he suggests a way of framing the catalogue entry that will give future scholars the clearest possible picture of what is known and what is uncertain, which amounts to a kind of knowledge in itself, the knowledge of where the edges of knowledge lie. The scribe returns to the writing board and finishes the entry, working through the remainder of it with the same unhurried care applied to the first lines. The completed entry, when it is dry, will be added to the running administrative record, maintained in the library's innermost archive, a set of papyrus rolls that themselves represent a kind of cumulative labor, each day's new entries adding to what came before, the whole growing slowly over years and decades like a living thing that adds new growth steadily and without drama. There is something in this work that is different from the work of copying, quieter in a different way. Copying requires the scribe to disappear somewhat into the text, to become transparent to it, transmitting rather than interpreting. Cataloging requires a different quality of attention, noticing, comparing, deciding, placing. It requires the scribe to stand slightly apart from the text and describe it, to hold it at a considered distance and say, this is what this is where it belongs, this is what we do not yet know about it. The library in this way is always in the act of knowing itself, not once and finally but continuously, turning its attention back on its own gathered contents and asking what it holds, and what it means, and whether the arrangement still serves the truth as well as it might. The scribe is one small part of that ongoing turning, the hand and the eye through which the institution reflects on its own accumulated life. The morning's cataloging work comes to its natural pause sometime near the middle of the day, not announced by any bell or formal signal, but felt rather in the quality of the light and in the particular kind of tiredness that settles behind the eyes after hours of close and careful reading. The sun has climbed to its highest point above Alexandria, and where the colonnades cast their long shadows earlier in the morning, those shadows have now pulled back and shortened, retreating close to the bases of the columns, so that the stone floors of the walkways are washed in a wide, even brightness. Inside the halls the light is warm and full, and the papyrus on the work surfaces seems almost to glow faintly with it, the pale golden sheets catching and softening the midday sun until the very material of the page seems luminous. The scribe sets down the reed pen with the unhurried deliberateness that marks the end of any section of work, and for a moment simply sits, allowing the hands to rest in the lap, allowing the eyes to move without focusing on any particular thing. Around the hall others are doing much the same, a scholar carefully rolling a scroll to its beginning and setting it aside, another rising slowly from a low stool and stretching the back with the careful patience of someone who has learned over many years how the body signals its need for rest. There is no sense of urgency in any of this, no hurrying toward the door. The transition from work to rest in the Mouseion tends to happen gently, one person and then another, moving toward the garden, the hall growing quieter by degrees. The garden of the Mouseion lies just beyond the colonnade on the southern side of the main hall, sheltered on 3 sides by the library's stone walls, and on the 4th by a low boundary of clipped hedges, beyond which the precinct continues into other walkways and outbuildings. It is a modest garden by the standards of Alexandria's great private estates, but it has been planted with care over many years, and at midday it offers what the halls, for all their cool stone, to not quite provide, the sense of being held within something growing. Several plane trees stand toward the eastern end, their wide-spreading canopy casting a deep shade over 2 stone benches worn smooth by long use. Along one wall a vine has been trained across a series of wooden supports to form a canopy of green leaves, and it is beneath this vine-covered walkway that many of the scholars prefer to sit at midday, sheltered from the direct sun while remaining in the open air. A small fountain stands near the center of the garden, a simple basin of pale stone from which water rises in a low, steady arc and falls back with a sound that seems to fill the space entirely, without ever being loud. It is the kind of sound that other sounds can rest inside of, the murmur of conversation, the soft cooing of pigeons on the warm stone, the distant texture of the city beyond the walls, and the fountain gives the garden a quality of enclosure, of being gently separated from the world of the morning's work, without being entirely removed from the world of living things. The midday meal is simple, carried in by servants who have prepared it in the kitchens that serve the Mouseion community. It is brought out in clay bowls and set on a long, low table beneath the vine, and the scholars and scribes gather around it without ceremony. There is bread, round, flat loaves of a kind that Alexandria bakes in abundance, slightly warm still from the morning's ovens, with a crust that gives just enough resistance and a soft interior that tears cleanly and cleanly. There are figs, some fresh and heavy with ripeness, their skins almost splitting, and some dried from the summer's harvest, dark and sweet and dense with concentrated sweetness. There is a soft white cheese, mild and slightly salty, crumbling gently when touched. There are olives, too, of the kind that arrive in Alexandria from the groves of the surrounding regions, preserved in brine and herbs, their flesh firm and their taste carrying something of the oil and the salt air together. Cold water is poured from a tall clay jug, the outside of which is slightly damp from the water that has seeped through the porous clay and evaporated, keeping the contents cool through the method of the material itself. The scribe lifts the cup, and the coolness of the water is a distinct and quiet pleasure after the close warmth of the morning's haul, and for a moment all attention is given simply to drinking, to the sensation of the cold water moving through the throat and settling into the body with something very close to relief. The conversation that moves among the scholars eating beneath the vine is soft and unhurried, carried on in the way of people who have shared many such midday pauses and who do not feel the need to fill the time with anything more than what naturally arises. One scholar speaks briefly about a passage encountered in the morning's reading, a line in a geographical text whose meaning had seemed clear until examined more carefully, at which point it had become pleasantly uncertain. Another offers a thought in response, and there is a short exchange that might, in another setting, have been argued with more energy, but here in the garden at midday it unfolds slowly, both speakers content to leave the question open. Someone else says very little, eating steadily, and watching the pigeons that have gathered at the far end of the garden, moving along the warm stone in that particular rocking way of pigeons, unhurried and intent on their own purposes. The light in the garden at this hour is at its most uncompromising, and also, in its way, at its most beautiful. It falls straight and clean from overhead, and the shadows it casts are sharp-edged and very dark. The shadow of a column falling across the stone floor has a precise band of deep shade. The shadow of a leaf from the vine overhead printing itself in clear outline on the white wall behind. Where the sunlight strikes the pale limestone directly, it seems almost to make the stone vibrate softly with warmth, and the air just above the ground shimmers very faintly in the way it does when the earth has been heated through for a long time and is releasing that warmth back upward. The scribe rests against the cool of the wall in the shade of the vine, one hand still holding a fig that has been eaten down to its stem, the other resting open in the lap. The sounds of the city arrive here faintly, the distant press of the harbor, a cart somewhere beyond the precinct walls, the low sound of the canopic way, carrying its midday life, but they arrive softened and without urgency, like sounds heard through cloth, present enough to remind one of the living world beyond, but not close enough to demand any response. The fountain continues its steady, unhurried sound. A pigeon settles on the rim of the basin, regards the water for a moment with great seriousness, then steps back and continues across the garden floor. The shade shifts very slightly, as the sun moves by a degree that is too small to notice directly, but that is nonetheless slowly, steadily moving the afternoon toward its own particular quality of light. When the scribe rises from the midday rest and returns through the colonnaded walkway into the interior of the library, the quality of the air inside has shifted in a way that is subtle but unmistakable. The morning had a certain brightness to it, a freshness carried in from the sea and the streets, a sense of the day still opening. The afternoon air is different, warmer, stiller, as though the building itself has absorbed the heat of the hours and settled more deeply into its own silence. The stone floors, cool at dawn, now hold a gentle, absorbed warmth underfoot. The papyrus on the shelves, the cedar of the storage cases, the dried ink on countless surfaces, all of it breathes out a scent that is richer and slightly heavier than it was at morning. the smell of things that have been resting undisturbed in warmth, patient and dry. The afternoon work is different in character from the work of the morning. The copying and cataloging that occupied the earlier hours have their own kind of intensity. A focused, forward-moving attention, a sense of production, of text accumulating line by line on fresh papyrus. What the afternoon calls for is something slower and more inward than that. It is the work of tending to what is already old, of placing careful hands on scrolls that have passed through many other hands before, and that bear the marks of all those years of handling and use. It is, in its way, the most meditative work the library asks of its scribes. A scroll is brought to the work table from one of the deeper storerooms, where the older and more fragile pieces of the collection are kept. It is carried carefully, with both hands, held level so that no part of it hangs unsupported. When it is set down on the wooden board and unrolled by a few careful inches, the first thing one notices is the color. Fresh papyrus is a pale, warm gold, nearly the color of late afternoon light itself. This scroll is older than that, noticeably so. Its surface has deepened to something closer to the color of dried honey or the shell of a walnut, a warm brown that speaks of years and of the slow action of air and light on the material of the plant. The fibers of the papyrus, which in a newer sheet lie smooth and close together, have here relaxed slightly at the edges. And along a section of the scroll, perhaps a hand's width from the beginning, the papyrus has split, not torn violently, but simply parted along the line of its own fibers, as old materials will do when they have been rolled and unrolled many times and handled by many different degrees of care over many seasons. The scribe examines the split carefully, leaning close and holding the edges of the damaged section very gently apart to see the extent of it. The crack runs across 3 lines of text, though it has not yet entirely destroyed the letters beneath. The ink still faintly legible along the damaged edge, but fragile now, dependent on nothing tearing further. The repair must be made before the scroll is handled again, before the crack widens, or the separated edges begin to curl and compound the damage. The paste used for this work is made from very thin, well-cooked flour and water, a substance so light and translucent when prepared correctly that it barely alters the appearance of the papyrus once dried, leaving only the faintest ghost of itself along the repair. A small pot of it rests on the work table, prepared earlier in the day by one of the custodians who maintains the repair materials. The scribe takes a very fine brush, finer than anything used for writing, and draws from the pot the smallest possible amount of paste, enough to coat only the thinnest margin of papyrus along one edge of the split. This is applied with a steadiness of hand that comes entirely from patience and slowness, not from any particular force or urgency. The paste goes on in a thin, even film, cool and slightly gleaming, and then a strip of fresh papyrus, narrow, almost like a ribbon, cut with great care from a sheet whose fibers run in the right direction, is laid along the join from the back, covering the split and providing something for the 2 edges to adhere to once the paste dries. For a time, the scribe simply holds this in place, applying only the gentlest pressure with 2 fingertips, feeling through them the faint warmth of the old papyrus and the slight dampness of the paste beginning to set. There is almost nothing to see while this is happening. The work is happening at the level of touch and time, not at the level of visible action. The room is very quiet. Somewhere across the hall, another scribe is at work, and the sound of a reed pen moving across papyrus carries softly through the air, that light, dry, whispering sound that is so particular to this building, so entirely its own. A little further away, the occasional barely audible sound of a scroll being carefully unrolled and laid flat on a reading board. Beyond the walls, muffled and distant, the sound of the city in its afternoon. When the scribe is satisfied that the join will hold, the scroll is set aside to dry fully before any further handling, and the attention turns to another damaged piece, this one presenting a different kind of problem entirely. The papyrus here is structurally sound, not torn or cracked, but the ink has faded in several places along the length of the text, particularly in sections that must have been exposed to stronger light than was good for them, or that were stored in conditions that allowed the surface to be touched too often by hands whose oils had slowly over years affected the ink above them. The letters in these passages are still present as shapes, just barely, but they are so pale that they can be read only in certain light, at certain angles, and only by someone who already knows what kind of writing they are looking for. This is where the comparative work begins. A second scroll, a different copy of the same text, is unrolled alongside the first, and the scribe moves between them with careful eyes, reading the clear version and using it to confirm what the faded letters in the damaged copy are attempting to say. The process is unhurried and deeply absorbing. It requires not the forward momentum of transcription, but something more like listening, a patient attention that allows faint things to gradually become more present, that waits for the eye to adjust and the mind to follow. Sometimes a letter that seemed entirely lost will resolve itself under continued patient regard, emerging not dramatically but quietly, the way a familiar shape becomes clear in low light once the eye has been given enough time to find it. When a word is recovered in this way, the scribe marks it softly in the margin of a working sheet, not yet inscribed permanently into any copy, but recorded, held against the possibility of later consultation or confirmation. There is something about this work that rests differently in the body than copying does. Copying asks the hand and eye and memory to work in a kind of brisk relay, passing text from source to hand to page in a steady, practiced rhythm. This asks instead for a kind of stillness, the shoulders settled, the breath slow, the eyes moving with great care, and no hurry between the two texts, the mind holding faint impressions and comparing them without forcing. The scribe who is suited to this work finds it not tiring but settling, the way that any task which requires genuine patience tends to quiet the parts of the mind that are otherwise restless. There are scrolls in this collection that are very old indeed, not merely decades old, but older than living memory, older than the library itself as it exists in its current form, copied in hands that belong to people who lived in times that now survive only in fragments exactly like these. When such a scroll lies open on the board and the afternoon light falls across it at its low, warm angle, illuminating the surface without quite bleaching the pale ink, there is a quality to the moment that the scribe feels without perhaps having words for it, the sense of something very long and very patient being present in the room. The words on the page were set down by a hand that no longer exists, in a year whose number belongs to a world that has entirely dissolved, and yet here they are, arriving in this afternoon, legible, recoverable, asking only for a careful pair of eyes and time enough to tend to them. The paste on the earlier repair has dried to its quiet, nearly invisible line. The scribe turns back to it and rolls the scroll a careful inch further, checking that the join holds smoothly and does not catch, and finds that it does. The old papyrus continues, its dark, even script running on beneath the amber surface, unhurried, still holding what it was given to hold. The human world of the Mouseion is itself a kind of text, layered and organized, each person within it occupying a place that has been thought about and arranged with something of the same deliberate care that is given to the shelving of the scrolls themselves. Just as the collection has its categories and its hierarchies of subject and author, so too the community of scholars and workers who move through these halls and gardens exists within a structure that is legible, once one has spent enough time here to read it, as clearly as a well-copied column of verse. At the outermost ring of this world are the custodians and servants, men and women whose names the scribe knows well by now, who arrive before the scholars in the early morning, and who are still moving through the corridors long after the last reader has departed. They sweep the stone floors with long-handled brooms of bound reed, working in the same quiet, unhurried rhythm that characterizes nearly everything within the Mouseion precinct. They carry water in broad clay vessels to fill the bowls used for dampening papyrus and washing hands, and they tend the oil lamps in the deeper corridors where natural light does not easily reach, trimming the wicks and refilling the shallow reservoirs with a practiced, unthinking ease. Without these people, the library would grow dusty and dark within a week, and the scrolls, which are more sensitive to damp and grime than they might appear, would begin very slowly to suffer. The scholars do not always pause to note this, occupied as they are with the contents of the texts before them, But the scribe who came to this work from a more modest beginning and who still understands the texture of practical labor tends to notice. Within the ranks of the scribes themselves there is also a quiet ordering. Newer scribes, those still developing the consistency and pace that careful copywork demands, are typically given texts that are already well established and whose reading presents fewer difficulties, works where the Greek is regular and the content unlikely to require trained scholarly judgment about disputed passages. Over time, as a scribe's hand becomes steadier and their familiarity with different textual traditions deepens, they are trusted with more complex material. Worn scrolls whose ink has faded unevenly, texts that exist in multiple divergent versions and require a practiced eye to navigate, or very old papyrus that must be handled with particular slowness and care. The scribe working this afternoon has reached that middle ground where the work assigned is neither elementary nor the most demanding the library holds, but carries with it a solid sense of responsibility, and that is its own form of quiet satisfaction. Above the scribes in this layered world are the junior scholars, and occasionally, in the broader tradition of the Mouseion's intellectual life, women, though they are fewer, who have come to Alexandria bearing letters of introduction, or who have been recommended by teachers elsewhere in the Greek-speaking world. Many of them hold small stipends from the royal administration, enough to cover their lodging in the city and their daily needs, though not so much as to constitute wealth. They are here to read, to compare, to debate, and sometimes to produce their own written work alongside the copying and cataloging labor that all scholars of the Mouseion are in some degree expected to contribute. In the mid-morning, in the early afternoon, several of them can often be found in the exedra, the large curved stone seating area that opens off the main colonnaded walkway, where they gather not in loud disputation, but in the kind of low, considered exchange that scholars favor. A question raised in a moderate tone, a response that weighs its words carefully, a passage cited from memory and then verified against a scroll that one of them has brought along for exactly this purpose. It is in these conversations that the intellectual life of the Mouseion becomes audible, though only just, in the way that a body of water becomes audible when one stands close enough to it without anyone speaking. Mathematics is discussed with the same unhurried gravity as geography, or the arrangement of verses into metrical categories. A scholar who has spent years working through a difficult text in medicine or natural history will bring their findings to the group not as a declaration, but as a contribution, something to be tested gently by others who have also thought about the same problems from different directions. There is a culture of patience here, a shared sense that the questions worth asking are rarely those that yield to haste, and that a good answer set down carefully is worth far more than a rapid one that cannot bear the weight of examination. The senior scholars are fewer in number and tend to move through the library with a somewhat different quality of presence, not hurried, for hurrying is essentially foreign to the Mouseion, but purposeful, as people who have particular ongoing projects that occupy them across months or years, rather than the single day's work that organizes a scribe's time. Some of them are working on treatises of their own, building from the resources of the collection towards something new, and they can be found in the reading halls with 3 or 4 scrolls open simultaneously, consulting one against another, making notes in a careful secondary hand on fresh papyrus sheets. Others are engaged in the great ongoing project of textual criticism, the slow, painstaking comparison of manuscript traditions to determine which readings are most likely to represent what an author originally set down. This is exacting work requiring not only patience, but a vast accumulated knowledge of how copyists make errors, how words drift from their original forms over generations of transmission, and how the preferences and assumptions of earlier scholars can leave invisible marks on the text they handled. The library holds, in principle, the best possible collection for this kind of work, which is part of why scholars travel far to be here. The head librarian moves through all of this as a kind of organizing presence, rarely intrusive but consistently felt. The office carries with it not only administrative responsibility for the collection, decisions about acquisition, organization, the assignment of copying projects, but also a kind of intellectual prestige, as the head librarian is understood to represent the library before the royal house of the Ptolemies, who are in every practical sense the institution's benefactors and sustaining force. The Ptolemaic patronage is not something the scribe encounters directly, It exists at a level of the city's life that is well above the daily round of copywork and scroll repair. But it is present in every material aspect of the scribe's day. The quality of the papyrus that is kept in good supply, the oil that burns in the lamps along the corridors, the simple meals available to scholars at midday, and the existence of the building itself, maintained and staffed and continually supplied. There is a distant, generous hand behind all of this, one that asks in return only that the work continue, that the scrolls be copied, preserved, catalogued, and kept. And within the Mouseion, that exchange is honored daily in the quiet repetition of exactly this. The exedra, when the afternoon is mild and the shade of the colonnade falls at its most comfortable angle across the stone seating, fills with a soft and intermittent murmur. A senior scholar reads aloud a line or two of verse to make a point, and the words drift across the garden and dissolve into the sound of the small fountain at its center, whose steady, unhurried fall of water has been part of this space for as long as anyone within it can remember. The scribe, passing through on the way back to the hall with a fresh supply of trimmed reed pens, catches a phrase or two of the conversation, something about the proper interpretation of a compound word in an early text, and carries it no further, returning to the work of the afternoon, where the scrolls wait in their patient rows, and the light continues its slow, warm movement across the floor. The light, by this hour, has traveled a great distance across the day. What arrived in the morning as a cool, pale illumination, falling sharply through the eastern openings of the hall, has shifted and softened and warmed over the course of many hours, and now, as the afternoon moves through its later portion, it enters the Mouseion from the west at a low and amber angle, laying itself across the floor in long, unhurried bands that reach deeper into the room than the morning light ever did. The colonnades along the western side filter this light, as they filter all light, breaking it into columns of warmth that fall between columns of shade, and the effect is one of extraordinary gentleness, as though the day itself is beginning to settle, to let its brightness ease from something clear and exacting into something golden and permissive. The papyrus rolls in their pigeonholes take on a different quality in this light. What appeared in the morning as pale and practical objects, tools of scholarship waiting to be used, now glow faintly at their edges where the amber light catches the fibrous curl of their ends. The small tags hanging from each roll, those careful syllaboi, each inscribed with its title and the name of its author, cast slim shadows against the wooden shelves behind them, and those shadows lean long toward the east, as everything at this hour leans long toward the east, the whole interior of the building subtly reoriented by the movement of the sun. Above the shelves in the upper air of the hall, where the light is richest and most diffuse, there are dust motes drifting in their slow, unguided way. They have always been there, stirred by the passing of hands and the unrolling of papyrus, and the movement of scholars through the space, but it is only in this particular light, at this particular angle, that they become visible, each one a tiny, weightless thing tracing its own unhurried path through the warm column of air, rising a little, falling a little, turning without intention, and the whole of it suggesting a kind of life in the air itself, a soft and invisible motion that has been present all day and only now reveals itself to anyone who happens to look upward from their work. The scribe returned to the writing table and seated once more upon the low stool, with the wooden board balanced across the knees and the papyrus sheet laid smooth and ready, does look upward for a moment. It is not a long pause, only the natural brief lifting of the eyes that comes when the body has been at rest and is gathering itself for the return to effort, and in that moment the light and the drifting motes register themselves quietly before the gaze comes down again to the work that waits. The scroll to be continued is the same one from the morning. It was set aside carefully at midday, its place marked by the precise memory of where the last clean line ended, and it has waited on the edge of the table through the afternoon's other work, the repair of damaged sheets, the consultation with a colleague, the return from the garden, in the patient way that all written things wait, asking nothing, offering themselves entirely when called upon. The scribe unrolls it now a little further, finding again the familiar territory of the text, the particular flow of its lines, the way the author's thinking moves through its arrangement of words, and there is something easing about the return to a text already partially known. The morning's work made a kind of acquaintance with this writing, and the afternoon continues that acquaintance into something approaching familiarity. The reed pen is lifted, rested briefly against the lip of the ink jar, drawn across lightly. There is a particular satisfaction in the weight of a well-trimmed pen held at the right angle, not too steep, not too shallow, and the way it meets the papyrus with exactly the right degree of pressure to set down a line that is clean and even from its beginning to its end. The scribe has developed this sense through long practice, years of mornings and afternoons spent in exactly this way, and it lives now not in deliberate thought, but in the hand itself, in the slight adjustment of grip that happens without instruction, in the way the fingers ease their hold as the stroke completes and lift again with the pen for the next. The text moves forward, character by character, and word by word and line by line. In the late afternoon, the work carries a quality different from the morning's, and different again from the more irregular rhythms of the afternoon's repair work. The body, by this hour, has found the particular ease that comes only after many hours of sustained occupation, not tiredness, or not exactly tiredness, but a kind of softening of the inner noise that ordinarily accompanies effort. The mind that was alert and somewhat watchful in the morning, checking itself at each line, noticing each decision, has settled now into a steadier and quieter mode. The words come, are read from the source scroll, are held for the brief necessary moment, and are then set down, and this process repeats with a rhythm that becomes over time as natural as breathing, as unhurried as the drift of those motes still turning in the light above the shelves. Other scribes work in the same late afternoon quiet. The sound of reed on papyrus, always a soft sound, is softer still by this hour, or perhaps it only seems so because the general noise of the building, footsteps, murmured consultation, the occasional movement of a heavy scroll case, has diminished as the day has progressed. There are fewer scholars in the hall now than there were at mid-morning. Some have completed their day's reading and departed. Some are gathered still in the garden or the etc., finishing a conversation that drifted there in the early afternoon and has not yet resolved itself. Those who remain in the hall work in a kind of shared quiet that is not arranged or agreed upon, but simply settles naturally over people who have been engaged in the same kind of careful, absorbing work for many hours, and whose silence has become companionable without anyone choosing to make it so. The air, which was still warm at midday and through much of the afternoon, has begun its slow evening cooling. It is only a slight change, and a welcome one, a very gentle lessening of the heaviness that heat accumulates in a stone building over the course of a long day, replaced now by something fresher moving in from the direction of the harbor, carrying with it the distant suggestion of the sea. This air finds its way through the western colonnades alongside the long amber light, and the combination of the two, the warmth of the light and the slight coolness of the air, creates the particular atmosphere of this hour, one of the more pleasant of the working day, an atmosphere that requires no effort to find comfortable, that simply offers itself without condition. The papyrus beneath the scribe's hand is warm at the edges from the light that has been resting on it, but cool in the shadowed part where the board beneath it keeps it steady. The ink dries quickly in this warmth, which is a practical advantage. There is no risk of smearing a freshly completed line when the pen moves on to the next, and the finished portion of the sheet already has the settled, permanent look of text that has dried fully and will not shift. Each column of writing, viewed from a small distance, has its own proportion and evenness, the lines spaced with the regularity that long habit produces, the margins held without measurement by an eye trained to see the balance of a page as simply and naturally as a hand feels the balance of a pen. The text continues to its next natural resting point, the end of a section, marked by a slight gap in the source scroll, and the scribe pauses, setting the pen down across the edge of the ink jar, and reads back over the last several lines, with the quiet attention of someone checking that what was intended is what was made. It is, or close enough that only the most exacting comparison would find a difference. The light falls warm across those completed lines, and for a moment the scribe simply allows the afternoon to be what it is. The long shadows, the amber colonnades, the drift of the barely visible motes, the soft and settled sound of the hall, the slight sea-cooled air, and the completed text drying slowly and surely into its permanence on the pale gold of the papyrus sheet. The light continues its slow migration across the hall. the warm amber of middle afternoon giving way now to something softer and more diffuse. The sun having moved far enough in its long arc that the direct shafts through the western colonnades have lengthened and thinned, reaching deeper into the room, but carrying less of their earlier intensity. The air holds a new quality, not yet the cool of evening, but beginning to suggest it, a slight freshening that comes in off the harbor and moves through the open colonnades with an almost imperceptible gentleness. It is the hour when the working day begins its gradual closing, not all at once but by slow degrees, the way a tide retreats by increments too small to observe in any single moment, yet undeniable when one looks up and notices how far the water has drawn back from where it stood before. The scribe recognizes this shift without needing to think about it. After many seasons of days spent in this hall, the quality of the fading light is as legible as text, and the body knows before the mind has named it that the hour of closing has arrived. The last completed sheet is set carefully to one side, placed flat on the wooden surface where it will continue to dry undisturbed. The ink along those final lines is still faintly raised to the touch, still releasing the last of its moisture into the air of the hall, and so the sheet is left with the deliberateness of someone who understands that patience is part of the work, that the completion of a thing includes allowing it to finish becoming what it is. The reed pen comes next. The scribe lifts it and turns it slowly in his fingers, examining the nib with the close attention that has characterized every handling of this tool throughout the day. The tip has worn slightly through the long hours of use, the careful split that allows ink to flow having widened just perceptibly, and the pen is set into the small pile of those that will need trimming before the following morning. A second pen, used only briefly and still in good condition, is placed in a separate group. This sorting is done without hurry, each implement considered on its own terms, the small knife laid nearby in case any immediate cleaning of dried ink along the nib seems warranted before the tools are stored away. There is a quality of care in this closing process that mirrors the care of the morning's preparation, the day shaped at both ends by the same deliberate attention to the materials that make the work possible. The ink jar receives its stopper, a small cork pressed down firmly and then given a slight turn to seat it properly, ensuring that the ink within, carefully mixed and thinned to the right consistency for this day's work, will not thicken or dry beyond use before morning. The jar is placed back in its position at the corner of the working surface, where it has rested through every hour of the day, its smooth clay sides marked faintly with the traces of many previous days' use, a patina of old ink and handling that has become part of the object's character. The water bowl, used through the day for fine corrections and for rinsing the pen between different sections of text, still holds a small quantity of water, now faintly gray with dissolved ink. This is carried carefully to the edge of the hall and emptied, the bowl then wiped dry with a cloth and returned to its place. Other scribes throughout the hall are moving through their own versions of this closing ritual, and the sounds of the space shift accordingly. Where the afternoon had held the soft, continuous rhythm of reed on papyrus, there is now the quieter and more intermittent sound of scrolls being carefully rolled. A scroll being rolled is a particular sound, barely a sound at all, more a soft pressure felt in the hands than heard by the ears, though in the quieting hall, even this small friction becomes part of the texture of the evening's approach. The scribe takes up the source scroll used through the afternoon, the worn and precious roll whose text has been followed so carefully through the day's copying, and begins to roll it back from the left, the red portion gathering onto the upper roller as the hands work slowly and evenly. The papyrus requires a certain firmness of pressure to roll smoothly without pulling, a touch that must be consistent from one moment to the next, and the scribe applies this touch with the ease of long familiarity, the roll building with satisfying evenness until the full scroll is gathered, and the end of the sheet rests flush and trim. The linen tie, a length of undyed thread kept alongside the scroll throughout the day, is wound twice around the rolled body of the scroll and knotted with a simple, secure knot, not so tight as to compress the papyrus within, but firm enough that the scroll will hold its form through handling and storage. The syllabus, the small tag that bears the title and attribution of the work, is checked to ensure it is still legibly tied in place, the faded ink of its lettering still clear enough to be read at a glance. Then the scroll is carried to its shelf, to the particular wooden pigeonhole where it rests when not in use, slipped into place with the care one gives to returning a thing to exactly where it belongs. The day's completed copywork, the fresh pages produced through the morning's careful transcription and the late afternoon's quieter continuation, is gathered and stacked with attention to the order of the pages. These sheets will be reviewed again tomorrow, compared once more against the source, before being prepared for binding into a new scroll, and so their sequence matters and is preserved by a slight mark in the margin of each sheet, indicating its place in the whole. The stack is placed under a smooth, flat piece of wood, light enough not to damage the papyrus beneath, but heavy enough to hold the sheets flat through the night, ensuring that any remaining tendency toward curl, left over from the rolling of the papyrus on its original core, is gently persuaded out by morning. The custodians have begun to move through the hall, and they carry with them small oil lamps that they set at intervals along the edges of the shelves and at the corners of the working tables. The flames of these lamps are modest, suited to the maintenance of the space rather than to continued reading or writing, and their light is warm and still in the quiet air. They mark the transition into evening in the most practical of ways, replacing the withdrawing daylight with something sufficient to see by, but clearly intended for closing rather than beginning. The custodians move through their work with practiced ease, setting each lamp in its place with the unhurried efficiency of those who have performed the same task through many seasons and know its rhythms entirely. The hall has grown noticeably quieter. The scholars who spent the afternoon reading have, one by one, completed their sessions and departed, carrying their notes or simply carrying the day's thinking with them into the evening. A senior scholar pauses near the door to exchange a few soft words with a colleague, voices low as if the quiet of the hall has established its own standard that even conversation at the threshold honors. Then both move out through the doorway and into the colonnade beyond, their footsteps fading into the larger sounds of the precinct, settling toward dusk. The scribe moves once more along the row of pigeonholes where the day's used scrolls now rest, checking each tag with a slow glance, confirming the order of things. There is a particular satisfaction in this final survey, in seeing the rolls at rest in their places, each one holding within its careful winding all the words it has held through every day of its existence, patient and undisturbed. The hall breathes around this stillness, the lamps casting their small warm circles, the air carrying the familiar and deeply settled smell of papyrus and old ink and cedar, the smell that has been present at every hour of this long day, and that remains, constant and grounding, as the last of the natural light dissolves away into the soft dark of early evening. The scribe turns from the pigeonholes and moves toward the doorway, stepping out through the tall wooden frame and into the colonnade that runs along the outer edge of the hall. The air that meets him here is immediately different from the air inside, cooler, carrying the first faint movement of an evening breeze that has traveled in off the harbor, and threaded through with the smell of the city beginning to shift into its nighttime self. The papyrus and cedar that have surrounded this day for so many hours give way gently to something broader and more open. Salt carried on the wind, the distant suggestion of cooking fires, the warm stone of the colonnade floor releasing the last of the afternoon's stored heat beneath his sandals. He walks the length of the covered walkway at an unhurried pace, passing the exexa where the stone benches now sit empty and pale in the dimming light, the garden beyond them settling into shadow. The fountain in the garden still catches a thread of the western sky's remaining brightness, its water moving in the quiet way it moves at every hour, indifferent to the time of day, steadily circulating in its stone basin as it has done through all the conversations and meals and afternoon rests that have taken place beside it. A pigeon sits motionless on the rim, feathers gathered close, already half settled into the stillness of the coming night. The scribe passes through the gate of the Mouseion precinct and out onto the street beyond, and the full presence of the city receives him. The sky to the west, visible in long slanted panels between the buildings, has deepened considerably since the last time he looked directly at it. Moving through shades of rose and soft orange, toward the first faint violet that gathers at the upper edge of the horizon. Above the harbor, which is briefly visible at the end of a wide cross street, the sky holds a particular luminosity that belongs only to cities near water at this hour, a glow that seems to come not only from the lowering sun, but from the sea itself, reflecting back the sky's colors with a slow, diffuse generosity. The street he walks runs roughly parallel to the Canopic Way, quieter than that great artery and more residential in character, lined with the facades of houses whose doorways are beginning to show the warm flicker of oil lamps lit inside. The sounds of households at their evening tasks drift through open windows and half-closed doors, the dull, rhythmic sound of grain being ground, the lower registers of conversation between family members who have gathered after the day's various occupations, the higher, lighter sound of a child's voice saying something that draws a soft response from an adult nearby. These sounds are ordinary and continuous, threaded together into the particular music of a neighborhood returning to itself after the dispersal of the working day. The light on the limestone walls of the buildings is extraordinary in this hour, golden and low and very slightly amber, the same quality that fills the library's western halls in the late afternoon, but here spread across an entire streetscape. The long facades, the column bases of a small covered portico attached to a fuller's workshop, the uneven paving stones of the street itself, all of it touched with a warmth that the midday sun never quite achieves. Shadows run long and precise from every vertical surface, and where a potted plant sits at the edge of a doorway, its leaves are lit from the side so that their edges glow faintly green against the darker interior beyond. The scribe walks past a temple precinct tucked between two larger buildings, its entrance marked by a low wall and two small stone pillars, modest and neighborhood scaled rather than grand. A priest moves within the enclosure, tending a lamp that burns on a narrow stone ledge beside the entrance to the inner shrine. The priest's movements are slow and deliberate, the careful attention given to a task repeated at the same hour each evening, and there is a quality of settled ritual to the small act, the adjusting of the wick, the slight cupping of a hand against any breath of wind, the checking that the flame has taken hold steadily before withdrawing. The lamp's light is very small against the fading sky, but it is entirely steady, and it remains visible for some time as the scribe continues along the street, a warm point in the gathering dusk. Farther along, where the street widens briefly around a neighborhood fountain, a small group of women have gathered with their clay water jars, filling them in the last usable light of the evening. The fountain is a simple one, a carved stone basin, fed by a pipe that delivers a thin, steady stream of water, and the sound of it, that small continuous falling of water into water, carries clearly in the air that has grown quieter now as the busier sounds of afternoon commerce have eased. The women speak among themselves in low voices, the conversation unhurried, comfortable in the way of people who share this errand at this hour often enough that it has its own social texture, its own familiar rhythms of exchange. One of the jars, lifted carefully and settled onto a cloth pad on a woman's head, catches the last rosy light from the western sky as she turns to go, its pale clay surface briefly luminous before she moves into the shadow of a doorway and disappears. The scribe moves on through the softening streets, his pace steady and easy, carrying the day with him in the particular way that a long day of careful and absorbing work settles into the body, not as tiredness exactly, though there is a pleasant weight to the limbs, but as a kind of fullness, the sense of having been occupied entirely and honestly throughout all the available hours. The words that have passed through his hands today, the lines of verse committed slowly and cleanly to fresh papyrus, the catalogue entries written in clear and careful notation, the worn scroll handled with patient attention in the afternoon, all of this sits quietly inside the walking body, not demanding thought, simply present. The harbor's smell is stronger now, the evening breeze having gathered itself into something more consistent, and with it comes the faint sound of water against the stone of the quays, the low calls of sailors settling their vessels for the night, the creak of ropes under small tensions. Alexandria breathes around all of this, its streets and doorways, its lamps beginning to multiply as the sky overhead deepens through violet toward the first suggestion of true dark, its fountains and temple precincts and colonnaded ways, its countless households, where the evening meal is being prepared and the day is drawing itself quietly and completely to a close. The scribe turns at last into the familiar narrower lane that leads toward his own modest door, and the sounds of the city grow softer still, absorbed by the close walls on either side, and the sky above is a deepening blue, and the first star, patient and small and entirely steady, has appeared above the rooftop at the lane's far end, as if it has simply been waiting all day for the light to recede enough to let itself be seen. The door to the scribe's home closes softly behind him, and the sounds of the lane outside diminish to almost nothing. A distant dog, the murmur of a neighbor's household through a shared wall, the faint ongoing breath of the city that never quite ceases, even as it settles and quiets. Inside, the single oil lamp on the low table casts its warm and steady light across the familiar objects of the room. The sleeping mat rolled against one wall, the clay storage jars, the small wooden shelf where the scribe's own modest collection of notes and working copies rests in orderly arrangement. The smell of the room is cool plaster and linen and the faint residue of ink that seems to have worked itself gradually and permanently into the air of any space where a scribe spends his hours. The evening meal is simple, as it has always been. A portion of lentils cooked softly with herbs, a heel of bread, a few olives in their dark oil, and a cup of well-watered wine that is more water than wine, cool from the clay vessel in which it has rested through the heat of the day. The scribe eats slowly, without hurry, the lamp flame steady beside the bowl, the food warm and plain, and deeply satisfying in the way that simple things become satisfying when the body has spent its energy and asks for nothing complicated in return. Outside, the city continues its gradual unwinding, its sounds growing more intermittent, more widely spaced, the silences between them growing longer and more complete. The words of the morning's text move through the scribe's memory as he eats, not urgently, not as something requiring attention, but in the easy way that a day's work leaves traces in the mind long after the hands have set it down. A particular turn of phrase from the lyric verse copied in the early hours returns briefly, settling and dissolving again without demanding anything. The catalog entries written in the mid-morning, the careful decisions made about the classification of a text whose attribution remained uncertain, these too pass through the quieting mind like the last light passing from a room, present and then gently absent. The lamp is extinguished, and the room fills with the particular quality of Mediterranean night darkness, warm and soft, traced at the edges by the faint glow from the lane outside, where some lamp or torch is still burning somewhere in the distance. The sleeping mat receives the scribe's weight, and the linen covering settles and stills, and breath slows in the way that it does when the body at last releases its long holding of the day, and the city outside continues its quiet transformation into something very nearly silent, and sleep comes gradually and without resistance. And in the Mouseion, in the great complex of the library, the night has settled completely and entirely over everything. The scribes are gone. The custodians have made their final slow passage through the halls, trimming and checking the small oil lamps left burning at intervals along the corridors. Not enough light to read by, but enough to find one's way, enough to keep the dark from being absolute. The flames of these lamps are small and still in the windless interior of the building, each one casting a circle of amber warmth onto the stone floor and the lower edges of the shelves, and leaving everything above in a soft and gradual dimness that deepens steadily toward the ceiling. The rolls rest in their pigeonholes, row upon row, each one tied with its cord, and bearing the small dangling tag, on which the title and author's name have been written in a careful hand. In the lamplight, these tags are too small to read, too distant from the flame, and they hang in their orderly rows in the near dark, like the quietest possible record of all the knowledge contained in this place. Poetry and philosophy, geometry and the movements of stars, the descriptions of distant coastlines and the habits of plants, the arguments of physicians and the accounts of historians, the verses of playwrights and the observations of those who had studied the behavior of animals, and the properties of numbers, and the nature of the heavens. All of it rests now in the dark, patient, and entirely still. The smell of the library at night is cedar and papyrus, and the faint ghost of ink, and the particular aged quality of old writing, dry and clean and somehow timeless. as if the smell itself belongs to no particular moment, but to the accumulated depth of all the hours this building and its contents have inhabited. The cedar that lines the shelves and storage areas holds its resinous coolness against the warmth of the Egyptian night. And the papyrus, so many thousands of rolls, so many surfaces of pale golden material, each covered in its columns of careful text, contributes its own dry, slightly sweet quality to the air, the smell of the reed plant from which it was made still faintly present beneath the layers of time and use. From somewhere distant, carried through some passage of the building's architecture that allows it to travel from the world outside, comes the sound of the sea. It is very faint, more sensed than heard, the long, slow rhythm of the harbor water moving against stone. The Mediterranean at its night ease, not stormy, not urgent, simply present and continuous, and immeasurably old. Alexandria is a harbor city, and even in its quietest hours the sea is always there beneath everything else, a ground note that the city rests upon without needing to acknowledge it, the way one does not notice steady breathing until the room is very quiet and there is nothing left to hear. The small lamp flames do not waver. The air inside the library is still, nothing moves among the shelves, nothing disturbs the careful arrangement of the rolls in their places, and the tags hang motionless on their cords, and the wooden pigeonholes hold their contents with the same orderly patience they have held them through all the days and nights of their keeping. Whatever season of the year it may be outside, whatever the harbor weather, whatever the condition of the city's streets and markets and households, this interior space maintains its quality of unvarying calm, its atmosphere of material preserved against loss, of knowledge held gently in trust against the passage of time. There is something in the nature of very old writing that the night makes more present, or perhaps simply more noticeable. The words on those thousands of rolls are not new. Many of them were set down long before the library itself existed, in other hands, in other cities, in other centuries, and they have passed through copyings and translations and the long, slow process of transmission to arrive here, at rest on these shelves, in this harbor city where the Ptolemies built their great institution of learning and filled it with the literary inheritance of the Greek-speaking world and beyond. The words are waiting, as they have always waited, for the morning and the returning light, and the hands that will unroll them once again and read. Outside, the city sleeps, the harbor sleeps, the scribe in his modest room near the Mouseion quarter sleeps, breathing slowly, the day entirely released. The stars above Alexandria complete their long arc through the hours of darkness, steady and unhurried, as they have done above every city and every library and every sleeping scholar, since long before anyone began to write the movements of the stars on papyrus and store the account carefully away. The lamp flames in the corridors of the library burn on, small and faithful, keeping their quiet company with the scrolls through all the remaining hours of the night, until somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness the city begins, once again almost imperceptibly, to stir.